The CEO mocked the maid's $5 gift until he saw the signature and realized who she really was. The heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom creaked open, a sound that didn't belong in a room made of digital precision. The celebration paused. The clinking of crystal glasses silenced as Ashley walked in. At 28, she possessed a quiet, radiant dignity that no grey housekeeping uniform could hide. Her dark hair was pulled back, highlighting a face that belonged on a classical statue. Strong, resilient, and hauntingly beautiful. She had been the head of his domestic staff for 3 years, ever since her mother, who had been his father's personal assistant for decades, had passed away. Elijah felt a strange, familiar tightening in his chest when he saw her. He had spent years maintaining a wall of professional ice between them, a defense mechanism he didn't fully understand. "Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the glass walls. "I know today is a momentous night for the company. Before you head down to the cameras, I wanted to give you this. My mother left it for me to give to you. She said it was to be delivered only when the Sterling name reached the pinnacle." She held out a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a simple piece of twine. Elijah felt the eyes of the board on him. He felt the need to perform, to show these sharks that he was as cold and unyielding as the building they stood in. Elijah took the box, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The warmth of her skin felt like a jolt of electricity compared to the chilled air of the room. He tore the paper away with a practiced indifference, revealing a small, chipped porcelain bluebird. It was tacky. The blue paint was peeling at the edges, and one wing had a hairline fracture. It was the kind of thing you'd find at a dusty roadside garage sale for $5. A ripple of snickering laughter went through the room. Douglas Schofield let out a sharp, mocking bark. "Is that the new Sterling strategy, Elijah? Trading in the lithium mines for thrift store trinkets?" Elijah felt a flash of irritation. He wanted to push away the strange vulnerability he felt under Ashley's steady gaze. He held the bird up between 2 fingers, mocking it. "A bird, Ashley?" he asked, his voice dripping with a condescension that made him feel sick even as he spoke it. "My company just hit $1 trillion. The world is waiting for my speech. And you bring me a piece of junk that isn't even worth the glue holding it together." "The value isn't in the paint, Mr. Sterling," Ashley replied, her gaze never wavering. "It's in the truth inside. My mother said you'd know when to look. I don't deal in riddles, and I don't deal in trash," Elijah sneered. He pulled open his junk drawer, the place where he threw useless business cards and broken pens, and tossed the bird inside. It landed with a hollow thud. "Go back to the basement, Ashley. Some of us have a world to run." Ashley didn't look insulted. She looked at him with a pity so profound it made his blood boil. "You have the world, Elijah," she whispered. "But look around. You're the only person in this room who is truly alone." She turned and walked out, the doors closing with a finality that left the boardroom feeling suddenly, chillingly empty. The gala roared in the levels below, a distant hum of jazz and high society chatter that felt 1,000 miles away from the stillness of the 100th floor. Elijah sat behind his desk, the amber liquid in his glass untouched. He kept looking at the junk drawer. Alone, the word Ashley had whispered, was a jagged glass shard in his mind. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet the silence of his office felt like a vacuum, sucking the air from his lungs. In a fit of restless agitation, he reached for a heavy leather-bound ledger, his hand clumsy from the simmering anger he couldn't quite name. His elbow caught the handle of the drawer he had slammed shut earlier. It jolted open, and the momentum sent the porcelain bluebird sliding across the polished mahogany. It hit the edge and plummeted. The sound was sharp, final. A tiny explosion of ceramic against the marble floor. Elijah cursed under his breath, kneeling to sweep the fragments into his hand. He didn't want the cleaning crew to see his mess. He didn't want to think about Ashley again. But as he reached for the bird's hollow head, he saw something metallic glinting among the white dust. It wasn't porcelain. It was a high-density micro SD card, vacuum-sealed in a thin plastic sleeve. Next to it lay a small, tightly rolled slip of yellowed parchment. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a $5 gift. This was a message. Elijah's fingers were trembling as he smoothed out the parchment. The handwriting was a punch to the gut. His father's hurried, slanted script. Elijah, if you are reading this, you have reached the summit I built for you. But the higher you climb, the harder it is to see the bodies buried at the base. Ashley's mother sacrificed her life to keep this secret. I lacked the courage to be a man. I chose to be a king. Now, the crown is yours. Choose wisely. Elijah felt a cold sweat break across his brow. He pulled a secure, air-gapped laptop from his safe, a device never touched by the company network. He slotted the card in. The screen flickered to life. It was a video recorded 20 years ago. His father, Caleb Sterling, looked skeletal, his eyes sunken with a guilt that no amount of money could mask. The Oak Haven Project, Caleb's voice rasped from the speakers. It wasn't a breakthrough in clean energy, son. We hit a toxic vein. Instead of stopping, I ordered the crew to bury the runoff under the town's reservoir. I paid off the inspectors. Built our $1 trillion empire on the slow poisoning of 3,000 people. The vow of restitution is on this card. If the company hits $1 trillion, the debt is due. You have to save them, Elijah. Even if it costs you everything. Elijah stared at the screen, the grainy image of his father's face reflecting in his wide, horrified eyes. Every diamond on his watch, every floor of this building, every meal he had ever eaten. It was all paid for by the silence of a dying town. And Ashley, the woman he had just mocked, was the daughter of the woman who had helped his father hide the truth, and then died carrying the weight of it. A soft click echoed through the room. Elijah slammed the laptop shut, his pulse racing. Douglas Schofield stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his celebratory smile anymore. He looked like a wolf that had finally decided to stop playing with its food. He walked into the room without an invitation, his eyes immediately darting to the shattered porcelain on the floor. "It's a heavy burden, isn't it, Elijah?" Douglas said, his voice dropping into a chilling, low tone. "The truth about Oak Haven. Your father became soft at the end. He thought he could buy his way into heaven by leaving you that card." Elijah stood up, his height usually an intimidating factor. But Douglas didn't flinch. "You knew. You were part of it. I am the one who kept the Sterling name from being dragged through the mud for 3 decades, Douglas snapped. "And I won't let a 28-year-old girl and a sudden bout of conscience destroy a $1 trillion valuation. Hand over the card, Elijah. We've already drafted the papers. If you don't cooperate, we'll declare you mentally unfit. A nervous breakdown brought on by the pressure. You'll be stripped of your name. And Ashley, well, she's a loose end we can no longer afford to keep." Elijah looked at the door. He wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He was thinking about Ashley, alone in the basement, with Douglas's security teams already moving in. The cold realization that he was a prisoner in his own ivory tower hit Elijah like a physical blow. He looked at Douglas, the man who had been a second father to him, and saw only a predator in a bespoke suit. Outside the frosted glass doors, the heavy shadows of corporate security blocked the only visible exit. "You've always been good at math, Elijah," Douglas said, checking his own gold watch. "Calculate the odds. You have no allies. You have no leverage. You have only that card. And the longer you hold it, the shorter your life becomes." Elijah didn't answer. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He remembered a detail from the building's construction that Douglas had likely forgotten: the specialized service chute behind the executive bar, designed for the discreet removal of sensitive waste. It led directly to the sub-level filtration rooms. He moved with a suddenness that caught Douglas off guard. Elijah grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from his desk and hurled it at the main office window. The reinforced glass spider-webbed, but didn't shatter. Instead, the impact triggered the high-decibel security alarm. In the momentary chaos of the blaring sirens and the flashing red emergency lights, Elijah dived behind the bar, pulled the hidden lever, and vanished into the darkness of the chute. The sensation was a blur of cold metal and gravity. He tumbled into a mountain of discarded linens in the basement laundry suite, his lungs burning. He was a trillion-dollar CEO covered in lint and sweat, but for the first time in 10 years, he was off the grid. The back alleys of the city were a labyrinth of steam and shadow. Elijah ran, his lungs screaming in the damp night air. He had shed his suit jacket, standing now in a white dress shirt that was quickly becoming translucent in the downpour. He reached a public terminal at the edge of the transit district. He didn't use his phone. Douglas would be tracking the GPS. Instead, he pulled a crumpled business card from his wallet that he had kept for years. Ashley's mother's old contact number. It was a long shot. But when the line clicked open, it wasn't an old woman's voice. It was Ashley. "Elijah?" She sounded breathless, as if she had been running too. "Where are you?" He gasped. Douglas sent men. He knows about the bird. "I'm at the old harbor station," she whispered. "My mother told me if the bird ever broke, I should never go home again." "Elijah, they're everywhere. Black SUVs, men with headsets. They aren't looking for a maid anymore. They're looking for a witness." "Stay there," Elijah commanded. "I'm coming to you. And Ashley, I'm sorry. I saw the video. I saw what they did to your mother's legacy." "Don't be sorry yet," she replied, her voice trembling, but firm. "Just get here. Before they realize you aren't in that building." The harbor station was a relic of the city's industrial past, a cavernous structure of rusted iron and salt-stained wood. Elijah found Ashley standing near a pile of shipping crates, her small frame swallowed by a dark raincoat. When she saw him, disheveled, soaked, and looking nothing like the king of energy, her eyes widened. "You really came," she said. Elijah didn't speak. He walked toward her, the space between them closing with an intensity that felt like a magnetic pull. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her shoulder. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "The card," he said, pulling it from his pocket. "It's all true. Oakhaven, the bribes, everything. My father, he didn't just build a company. He built a graveyard." Ashley looked at the tiny piece of plastic in his hand. "My mother spent her life waiting for the Sterling family to do the right thing. She died believing you were different from your father. She said you had his eyes, but not his heart." Elijah looked at her, and the romantic tension that had been a silent hum between them for years finally reached a breaking point. In the middle of a freezing harbor, with corporate assassins closing in and his fortune evaporating by the second, he realized she was the only thing in his life that wasn't a lie. "I'm not going back, Ashley," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "Not to the penthouse. Not to the board. If we do this, if we release this truth, I'm done. I'll have nothing." "You'll have the truth," she said, her hand moving to cover his. "And for the first time, you'll have a life that belongs to you." He leaned in, and as the sound of distant sirens began to wail, he kissed her, a desperate, soaring promise that the empire could burn as long as they were standing together in the ashes. The city had become a foreign land, a sprawling grid of blue and white light that felt like a digital cage. Every street camera was a potential eye for Douglas Schofield, and every idling black sedan was a threat. Elijah drove a battered 20-year-old pickup truck he had purchased for cash from a scrapyard on the city's edge. The leather seats were cracked, and the engine groaned with every shift, but it had no GPS, no satellite uplink, and no connection to the Sterling server. Beside him, Ashley was hunched over a paper map. At 2008, she had lived a life of quiet preparation, yet the reality of being a fugitive was etched in the tension of her shoulders. "We can't take the main interstate to Oakhaven," she whispered, her eyes scanning the faded ink of the map. "Douglas will have the state police looking for this plate within the hour. We have to take the back roads, the old coal routes, through the valley." Elijah looked at her, the flickering dashboard lights casting long shadows across her face. "You've been thinking about this for a long time, haven't you? The escape, the truth." "My mother didn't just give me that bird to hold on to a secret, Elijah," Ashley said, looking out at the passing dark woods. "She gave it to me, so I would be ready for the day the Sterling family finally ran out of lies. She knew the moment you hit $1 trillion, you'd either become a saint or a monster. She wanted to make sure I was there to see which one you chose." Elijah gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "And what do you see now, Ashley? A man who lost everything in a single night." Ashley reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his forearm. The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through him that felt more vital than any corporate victory. "I see a man who finally realized that $1 trillion is just a very expensive way to be alone." As they crossed the border into the valley leading toward Oakhaven, the atmosphere changed. The glittering glass of the city was replaced by rusted skeletons of old factories and quiet, dilapidated towns that time had forgotten. This was the foundation of the Sterling Empire, the places they had extracted wealth from and then discarded like empty husks. They pulled into a small, overgrown turnout overlooking a dormant reservoir. The air here was heavy, smelling of damp earth and something metallic, something that didn't belong in nature. "This is it," Ashley said, her voice trembling. "The start of the runoff zone?" Elijah stepped out of the truck, the cold air hitting his face. He looked at the water, which looked dark and stagnant under the moon. According to the video on the SD card, the primary leak had started right beneath this very ground. "My father called this his greatest achievement," Elijah said, his voice hollow. "He told me he had brought energy to the world. He never told me he had taken the life out of the earth." Ashley walked up beside him, her presence a silent comfort in the dark. "He wasn't a monster, Elijah. He was just a man who was too afraid to be poor. He thought he could buy his way out of the guilt, but the debt just kept growing. And now the interest is due." She turned to him, the moonlight catching the tears in her eyes. The romantic tension that had been building since the harbor was no longer a flicker. It was a flame. In this graveyard of his family's making, Elijah realized that Ashley was the only beautiful thing left in his world. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the branches of the dead trees. Elijah turned to Ashley, his heart hammering against his ribs. The wealth was gone. The power was gone. And by tomorrow, his name would be dragged through every tabloid on the planet. But as he looked at her, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. "I don't know if I can fix this, Ashley," he whispered, his hands finding hers in the dark. "I don't know if $1 trillion is enough to clean the blood off these stones." "You can't fix the past, Elijah," she replied, her fingers interlacing with his. "But you can stop the future from being a lie. That's why my mother stayed. That's why I stayed, not for the company, but for the chance that one day a Sterling would stand here and actually see the people they hurt." Elijah leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The class divide that had separated them for a decade, the penthouse and the basement, the boss and the maid, was gone. They were just two people standing on the edge of a cliff, holding on to the only truth they had left. "If we go to Oakhaven tomorrow," Elijah said, "there's no coming back. Douglas will have the site locked down. He'll do anything to stop us from taking samples. Then we don't go as a CEO and a maid, Ashley said, her voice growing stronger. We go as the people who are going to finish what our parents started. Elijah kissed her then, a slow, solemn promise in the shadows of the reservoir. It wasn't a kiss of triumph, but one of defiance. As they stood together in the ruins of his father's empire, the billionaire finally understood that the most powerful thing he ever owned was the heart of the woman who had dared to tell him the truth. The road to Oakhaven was no longer a road. It was a scar across the landscape. As the truck groaned up the final ridge, the thick forest gave way to a high chain-link fence topped with coils of razor wire. This wasn't just corporate property. It was a military-grade exclusion zone. Warning signs, faded by the sun and splattered with mud, screamed about environmental hazards and trespassers will be prosecuted, but the real hazard was the truth buried beneath the soil. Elijah killed the headlights and let the truck coast into the deep shadows of a cluster of dying oak trees. The silence of the valley was unnatural. There were no crickets, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just the distant, rhythmic hum of a generator and the sweeping white beam of a guard tower's searchlight. "The old service gate is half a mile east," Ashley whispered, her breath visible in the freezing cabin air. She was holding an old set of blueprints her mother had kept hidden for 28 years. The sensors there were bypassed during the original burial, so the trucks could move in secret. If we're lucky, Scorefield's technicians haven't found the hardware override yet. Elijah looked at her, his hand finding hers in the dark. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. "Ashley, once we cross that fence, we aren't just whistleblowers. We're targets. Douglas won't call the police. He'll call the men who don't exist on payroll." "I spent my whole life living in the shadow of this fence, Elijah," she said, her eyes reflecting the distant searchlight. "I'm not going back to the shadows." The wire groaned as Elijah pulled back a loose section of the fence near the rusted service gate. They slipped through like ghosts, the mud sucking at their boots. Every step felt like a violation of a mass grave. The ground here felt different, spongy and uneven, as if the earth itself was trying to reject what had been forced into its belly. They reached the primary site A, a concrete slab that was supposed to be a defunct research station. In reality, it was the cap on the reservoir. As Elijah moved toward the terminal housing, a sudden red light flickered from the top of the concrete structure. Click, clack, the sound of a bolt action echoed through the clearing. "Don't move, Mr. Sterling," a voice rasped. "You really should have stayed in the penthouse. The air is much cleaner up there." 3 men emerged from the fog, clad in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. These weren't standard security. They were the extraction team Douglas had threatened. The lead operative stepped forward, his rifle leveled at Elijah's chest. "The card, Elijah," the man demanded. "And the girl. Douglas wants to make sure the Sterling name stays pure." Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline that eclipsed any fear. He stepped in front of Ashley, his body a shield between her and the barrel of the gun. He didn't have a weapon, but he had something these men didn't expect, a total lack of concern for his own survival. "You're a long way from the corporate office, boys," Elijah said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm tone that had made him a legend in the boardroom. "Do you think Douglas is going to pay your legal fees when the EPA finds the bodies you're standing on? Or do you think he'll just bury you next to the chemicals?" The lead guard hesitated for a fraction of a second, a ripple of doubt in his professional exterior. That was all the opening Ashley needed. She grabbed a heavy rusted iron pipe from the debris pile and swung with a desperation born of 28 years of suppressed rage. The pipe connected with the guard's knee, a sickening crunch echoing through the valley. As the man went down, Elijah lunged for the second guard, tackling him into the mud. The struggle was raw and brutal. Elijah wasn't fighting for a merger or a stock price. He was fighting for the woman who had shown him what it meant to be human. He managed to wrest a flare gun from the guard's belt. He didn't point it at the men. He pointed it at the generator. "Back off!" Elijah roared as the flare hissed to life in his hand. One spark, and this whole site goes up in a chemical fire that even the sterling money can't hide. Move. The men, realizing the volatility of the runoff beneath them, backed into the fog. Elijah grabbed Ashley's hand, and they bolted toward the research station's sub-level entrance. They were inside, but the cage was closing. The sub-level entrance hissed as it sealed shut, a heavy pressurized door cutting off the sound of the wind and the barking dogs outside. Inside, the research station was a time capsule of the late 1980s. Dust motes danced in the beam of Elijah's flashlight, coating ancient computer terminals and stacks of green bar paper. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and the unmistakable, sickly sweet scent of chemical decay. Elijah leaned against the door, his chest heaving. In the dim light, he saw Ashley staring at a wall of photographs near the main console. They were Polaroids of the original crew, and there in the center was her mother, looking young and vibrant, standing next to a much younger, more hopeful Caleb Sterling. She wasn't just his assistant, Elijah, Ashley whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo. She was his conscience. And when he decided to bury the spill, he buried her spirit right along with it. She spent the rest of her life cleaning up after him, hoping that one day the mess would finally be gone. Elijah walked over, standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from her. The adrenaline of the fight was replaced by a heavy, aching realization. She stayed to protect me, didn't she? She knew that if she spoke up, Douglas would have destroyed us both. She stayed because she saw the boy you were, Ashley said, turning to him. The boy who used to hide in the gardens and draw birds instead of studying stock market reports. She loved that boy, Elijah, and I think she knew he was still in there, somewhere. They moved deeper into the bunker, toward the primary containment monitor. This was the heart of the Oakhaven crime. Elijah slotted his father's master key into the console, and the ancient monitors flickered to life with an emerald green glow. The data were damning. Real-time sensors, still functioning on a backup thermal loop, showed that the containment was a myth. The toxic runoff was active, slowly migrating toward the town's primary aquifer. The trillion-dollar empire was being powered by a ticking time bomb. "It's not just a past mistake," Elijah said, his voice cold with horror. "It's happening right now. Every day this company stays in business, more people are getting sick. Douglas isn't just protecting a secret. He's protecting an ongoing slaughter." Ashley was recording the screens with her phone, her hands trembling. "We have enough, Elijah. The signatures, the sensor data, the video. We can end this." Suddenly, the monitors turned red. A synthesized voice echoed through the concrete halls. "Security breach detected. Level 5 lockdown initiated." The lights cut out, replaced by the rhythmic, pulsing glow of emergency strobes. They were trapped 3 floors underground in a facility designed to survive a nuclear blast, and the only man with the override codes was the man who wanted them dead. In the claustrophobic darkness of the bunker, the silence was broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the sound of their own breathing. Elijah pulled Ashley into the shelter of a heavy steel desk, as the sound of the ventilation system grinding to a halt signaled that the air was being cut off. "Elijah," Ashley whispered, her voice tight with the onset of panic. "If we don't get out, if the signal doesn't go through." "It will," Elijah said, his voice fierce. He took her hands, his thumbs stroking her knuckles. "I spent 40 years building walls, Ashley. I built them out of glass, steel, and money. But they were all just cages. This, being here with you, this is the first time I've actually felt free." He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her temple. "I don't care about the company. I don't care about the legacy. I just want to get you out of here." "Then stop being the CEO," Ashley said, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "Stop trying to manage the situation and start being the man my mother believed in. There's an emergency manual release for the pressure valves in the coolant room. If we can trigger a back pressure surge, the main doors will have to cycle open to prevent an explosion." Elijah looked at her, a surge of pride and love washing over him. She wasn't just a witness. She, his partner. He kissed her, a deep, lingering seal of a new life. "Let's go blow some valves." The air in the sub-level bunker was thinning, growing heavy with the scent of hot metal and desperate hope. Elijah and Ashley moved through the shadows of the coolant room, their path illuminated only by the rhythmic, crimson pulse of the emergency strobes. Above them, the sounds of heavy boots thudded against the steel floor. Douglas's men were trying to bypass the manual seals. "The pressure valves are behind the secondary cooling array," Ashley whispered, her voice tight but focused. "If we force a backflow, the system will think a meltdown is imminent. It'll trigger an automatic atmospheric purge. Every door in the facility will cycle open for 10 seconds to vent the pressure." Elijah reached the massive iron wheel of the primary valve. It was rusted, frozen by decades of neglect, much like his own conscience had been. He gripped the wheel, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted in a silent roar of effort. For a man who had spent his life pushing buttons and signing papers, the raw, physical struggle felt like a liberation. "Together," he gasped, reaching out his hand. Ashley placed her hands over his, her smaller frame adding the weight of her entire history to the turn. With a screech of protesting metal, the wheel budged. A low, guttural groan echoed through the pipes, the sound of a trillion-dollar lie finally being unmade. Hiss, clang, vroom! The bunker shuddered as the pressure surge hit the main lines. A synthesized voice, now distorted by the strain on the system, blared through the halls. "Critical pressure anomaly. Initiating atmospheric purge. Stand clear of all bulkheads." Suddenly the massive steel doors at the end of the corridor groaned and slid upward. Elijah grabbed Ashley's hand, and they sprinted toward the light. In the corridor, 2 of Douglas's guards were caught off guard by the sudden roar of venting steam. Elijah didn't stop. He used his momentum to tackle the first guard, sending him spiraling into the shadows, while Ashley dodged a desperate grab from the second. They reached the service lift, just as the countdown reached its final seconds. The doors began to slide shut, a wall of steel threatening to seal them in forever. Elijah lunged forward, his shoulder catching the edge of the door to hold it just long enough for Ashley to slide through. He tumbled in after her, the heavy metal clanging shut with the finality of a guillotine. They were rising. The sub-levels were behind them, but the surface was a hornet's nest. They emerged into the freezing rain of the Oakhaven outskirts, far from the main entrance where the SUVs were clustered. The battered truck was still where they had hidden it, a ghost in the fog. Elijah fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with oil and rain, until the engine roared to life with a defiant growl. "We have 4 hours, Elijah said, checking the cracked screen of his watch. 4 hours until Douglas takes the stage at the gala. If we aren't in that AV booth by then, he'll have the board sign the emergency transition papers. He'll bury the Oakhaven data, and he'll bury us." Ashley looked at the glowing screen of her phone, where the uploaded data was slowly ticking toward completion on a private cloud server. "The world is already starting to wake up, Elijah. Look." She showed him a social media feed. Photos of the black SUVs in Oakhaven were already going viral, posted by local residents who were tired of being ignored. The king of energy was missing, and the shadows were starting to speak. "Let them talk," Elijah said, slamming the truck into gear. By the time we're done tonight, they won't just be talking. They'll be screaming for justice. As they tore down the dark highway toward the city skyline, the romantic tension that had been a slow burn throughout the night reached a fever pitch. Ashley leaned over, her hand resting on the back of his neck, her touch a grounding force amidst the chaos. "We're going to lose everything, aren't we?" she asked softly. Elijah looked at her, the woman who had traded a quiet life for a dangerous truth, and he smiled. It was the first time he had felt truly rich. "No, Ashley. For the first time in our lives, we're going to have exactly what we deserve." The city skyline approached like a jagged crown of thorns. To the world, the Sterling Tower was the center of a historic triumph. To Elijah and Ashley, it was a fortress held by an enemy who had everything to lose. As the battered truck rolled through the rain-slicked outskirts, Elijah saw the first signs of the lockdown. Black and white security cruisers, private contractors for Sterling Power, were stationed at every major bridge and tunnel. "They aren't just looking for us," Elijah said, his voice a low, focused rumble. "They're filtering the city. Douglas has turned the metropolitan area into a funnel, and we're heading straight for the narrow end." Ashley looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the neon glare of a passing billboard. The 2008-year-old woman who had started the night as a ghost in his hallways was now the architect of his survival. "They're looking for a billionaire and a maid, Elijah. They're looking for the man in the $5,000 suit and the girl in the gray apron. We have to stop being those people." They pulled into a desolate industrial park beneath the elevated subway tracks. In the back of the truck, they found a stash of discarded high-visibility vests and heavy-duty tool belts left behind by a local utility crew. Elijah shed his ruined white dress shirt, pulling on a grimy, insulated work jacket. Ashley tucked her hair beneath a weathered baseball cap, her face smudged with grease to hide the refined features that Douglas's facial recognition software would be hunting. The Sterling Tower was a marvel of modern architecture, but its greatest weakness lay in its foundation. Ashley led Elijah through the maze of the city's steam tunnels, the humid, iron-scented veins that moved beneath the streets. Here, the air was thick with the roar of pressurized pipes and the smell of ancient stone. "Most people think the building starts at the lobby," Ashley said, her voice echoing off the damp brick walls. "But it starts 4 stories down, in the filtration and power generation hub. My mother used to say that the people in the penthouse forget that the basement is what keeps them from falling." Elijah watched her move with a confidence that left him in awe. He had spent his life looking at the building as a symbol of his ego. She saw it as a machine she knew how to dismantle. As they reached a heavy steel door marked Sub-Level 4, Maintenance Only, Elijah stopped her. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the back of her palm. "Ashley, if we get separated in there, if I don't make it to the mezzanine—" "Don't," she whispered, stepping into his space. The heat between them was a sharp contrast to the cold damp of the tunnels. "We've spent 10 years being separated by flaws and titles. We're in this together now. One truth, one mission." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and determination. It was the last moment of peace before the war. The gala was in full swing 100 floors above. Through the service fence, Elijah could hear the muffled, rhythmic thumping of the orchestra and the distant, polite applause of the world's elite. They moved through the internal service elevator, a slow, groaning cage used for trash removal. They emerged on the 99th floor, the AV mezzanine. This was the nerve center of the global broadcast, a room filled with glowing server racks and miles of fiber optic cable. The technical crew was focused on the main stage feed, where Douglas Schofield was just beginning to walk toward the podium, his face projected on giant LED screens that lined the grand ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Douglas's voice boomed through the speakers, "tonight we celebrate a $1 trillion legacy, a legacy of purity, a legacy of power." Elijah and Ashley slipped behind the primary server bank. Elijah's fingers flew across the manual override keyboard, his mind a blur of the encryption codes his father had whispered on his deathbed. "I'm in," Elijah hissed. "I've bypassed the corporate firewall. The satellite uplink is ours." Ashley held the micro SD card out to him, her eyes bright with a fierce, romantic fire. "Change the world, Elijah." He slotted the card in. On the monitors, the image of Douglas Schofield began to flicker, a digital ghost appearing in the machine. Elijah's hand hovered over the source swap button. He looked at Ashley, and in that moment, he realized he wasn't just ending an empire, he was beginning a life. He slammed his hand down. The screen didn't just flicker, it transformed. The silence that swept through the grand ballroom was more deafening than any explosion. On the massive 4-story LED screens, the polished image of Douglas Schofield froze, glitched, and was suddenly replaced by a grainy, high-definition ghost. The world watched as Caleb Sterling, the saint of energy, sat in a dim office 20 years ago, his voice trembling with a confession that turned the trillion-dollar celebration into a digital wake. He spoke of the Oak Haven Reservoir, the bribes, and the slow, calculated poisoning of a town for the sake of a stock price. Down in the ballroom, the elite of the financial world stood like statues, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Douglas Schofield, still standing at the podium, looked up at his own undoing. His face went from a mask of arrogance to a pale, sweating canvas of terror. In the AV mezzanine, Elijah watched the monitors with a grim, soaring satisfaction. Beside him, Ashley leaned against the server rack, her eyes fixed on the screen. For 28 years, her family had carried this weight. Now, the world was carrying it with them. "The stock," Ashley whispered, pointing to the live ticker at the bottom of the feed. It was a bloodbath. The trillion-dollar valuation wasn't just dropping, it was evaporating. Billion-dollar chunks of the Sterling Empire were vanishing every second as the global markets reacted in a frenzy of panic. The king of energy was being dethroned in real time, and the only thing more volatile than the stock was the fury of the people in the room. The doors to the AV mezzanine didn't just open, they were kicked in with a violence that sent sparks flying from the hinges. Douglas Schofield burst into the room, his tuxedo disheveled, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who had lost his god. He wasn't alone. 3 of his personal security detail followed, their hands moving to the holsters beneath their jackets. "Cut it!" Douglas screamed, his voice cracking. "Elijah, cut the feed now, and I might let you live to see the bankruptcy hearings." Elijah stepped out from behind the server bank, standing tall. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found his footing. "It's a satellite uplink, Douglas. It's being mirrored by every major news outlet on 3 continents. There is no cutting it. The truth doesn't have an off switch." Douglas pulled a small, silver handgun from his waistband. His hand was shaking, a tremor born of the realization that his life's work was now a global crime scene. "You've destroyed everything. 30 years of building this legacy, and you throw it away for a girl who empties your trash?" "She didn't empty my trash, Douglas," Elijah said, his voice dropping into a chilling, calm register as he stepped in front of Ashley. "She saved my life. And she saved yours, too, by making sure you can't hurt anyone else." The tension in the small, humming room was a physical weight. The security guards looked at Douglas, then at the monitors showing the federal authorities entering the lobby downstairs. They were professionals. They knew when a contract was dead. One by one, they stepped back, their hands raised in a silent surrender to the inevitable. Douglas looked at his men, then back at Elijah and Ashley. He let out a dry, hysterical laugh. "You think you've won? You're broke, Elijah. You're going to be the most hated man in history. You'll have nothing." "I'll have a clean conscience," Elijah replied, "and I'll have the woman I love. That's a better valuation than anything you ever put on a spreadsheet." A sudden, heavy thumping echoed from the hallway. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." "Open the door." Douglas slumped, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the metal grating of the floor. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in total, crushing defeat. As the agents swarmed the room, pinning Douglas to the floor, Elijah felt a hand slide into his. He turned to Ashley. Her cap was gone, her dark hair messy, her face smudged with the grime of the tunnels. To Elijah, she had never looked more beautiful. The romantic tension that had fueled their flight across the state finally settled into something permanent. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Elijah said, pulling her into his arms as the sirens wailed outside. "We're just getting started." The morning sun rose over a city that felt fundamentally different. The Sterling Tower was no longer a symbol of untouchable power. It was a crime scene. Elijah sat on a simple wooden bench in a small park 3 blocks away, watching as the sunrise hit the glass of his former office. He was wearing a borrowed coat, and his bank accounts had been frozen by federal investigators, but the weight that had been crushing his chest for a decade was gone. Ashley sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. They had spent the night in a quiet precinct, giving statements that would dismantle a $1 trillion lie. "The board is gone, Elijah," she said softly. The Oak Haven Trust was activated the moment the video went live. "The cleanup begins today." Elijah turned to her. At 2008, she was looking at a world that finally recognized her existence. "I have nothing left to give you, Ashley. No jewelry, no mansions, no private jets. Just a name that's going to be dragged through the mud for years." Ashley took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I never wanted the sterling fortune, Elijah. I wanted the man who was brave enough to let it go." 6 months later, the transformation of Oak Haven was no longer a dream. It was a massive, visible reality. Elijah hadn't fled to a private island. Instead, he and Ashley had moved into a modest cottage on the edge of the valley. He spent his days working with environmental engineers, using his knowledge of the company's infrastructure to help identify the deepest veins of the old spill. The romantic tension that had been forged in the fire of their escape had deepened into a resilient, quiet love. They were no longer the CEO and the maid. They were partners in a project of radical honesty. One afternoon, while walking through a newly decontaminated meadow, Ashley stopped and pulled a small object from her pocket. It was the bluebird, carefully glued back together. The cracks were still visible, but the shape was whole. "My mother used to say that a cracked vessel can still hold water if it's handled with care," she said, handing it to him. Elijah looked at the bird, then at the woman who had saved him. "We're a lot like this bird, aren't we? Broken in places, but standing." The story of Elijah and Ashley didn't end with a financial recovery, but with a moral one. The Sterling name eventually became a case study in corporate redemption. While Elijah was technically broke by the standards of his former life, the community of Oak Haven treated him with a respect that no amount of money could ever buy. In the final scene of their journey, Elijah and Ashley stand on the ridge overlooking the valley. The water in the reservoir is clear, and for the first time in 30 years, the birds have returned to the trees. Elijah pulls Ashley close, the sunset casting a warm, golden glow over them. "I used to think $1 trillion was the peak of the world," he whispers, kissing her forehead. "And now?" she asks, smiling up at him. "And now," he says, looking out at the life they've built together, "I realize that the only thing worth owning is a heart that's finally at peace."